On Press Perspective today, we shed light on North Korea's nuclear-related work at its Yongbyon facility throughout this year in a clear indication of the regime's intentions to advance its fissile material production capabilities. Do stay with us. Welcome to Press Perspective for this Wednesday, November 26th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we delve into findings published by US-based monitoring website 38 North in relation to North Korea's nuclear weapons program. For more on this, I have Shreyas ready with news website NK News here in the studio. Shreyas, welcome back.
Thank you.
I also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Park, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Shreyas, we shall start here in the studio. Let's begin with details of this analysis about North Korea's nuclear-related activities by the website 38 North.
Yes. So essentially 38 North, on the basis of satellite imagery, has assessed that, that North Korea is constructing an additional enrichment facility at its main nuclear reactor at Yongbyon. And this is located near the radiochemical laboratory. And this is something that, according to them, has been an active development since the start of the year. A lot of this is based on what they've observed in terms of new support buildings being constructed in the eastern part of the complex, which supposedly were complete as of October. And on top of that, since September, they've also apparently been working on 6 possible heat exchangers, which are responsible for cooling the centrifuges. And essentially, what this has done is it's kind of feeding the possibility that North Korea is looking to step up activity at Yongbyon, preparing for some potential purposes. And a lot of this is also borne out by other renovation work, some of it just regular refurbishment, but at the same time they also seem to be doing some excavation essentially near the storage vault and trying to potentially build up new facilities, and that is what 38 North is saying. And at the same time, they're also trying to strengthen what is already there after damage from the rains over the course of the summer. There was a lot of flooding, so they're trying to strengthen the dam to prevent such damage in the future. And at the end of the day, that's something that they deal with every year. And for now, though, we don't really have any clear indication for certain that they're setting up for something major, but it certainly continues an ongoing trend of development at Yongbyon and, of course, other facilities that Kim Jong-un has visited over the past year.
Right then, based on what has been shared about this development, Professor Park, what aspects of this analysis concern you most?
Well, it is obvious that North Korea is not just maintaining Yongbyon, but is definitely expanding it. All these upgrades point toward an effort to increase North Korean nuclear material production capacity and protect the site so that operations can continue long into the future. Strategically, this means we should expect North Korea's nuclear program to grow rather than stagnate. For the reason, this has a couple of implications. First, it could allow North Korea to grow its arsenal faster than before. Even a modest increase in production capacity can translate into several additional nuclear warheads each year, and that changes the deterrence equation for South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Second, it complicates diplomacy. If North Korea is actively expanding production, it becomes much harder to freeze the program at current levels, let alone roll it back. In other words, the window for even arms control type agreement becomes narrower. Third, the infrastructure upgrade, like a flood protection, as just Shreyas mentioned, show long-term intent. The North Koreans are working on the flood protection infrastructure along the Guryong River. That might sound minor, but Yongbyon is vulnerable to flooding. reinforcing the riverbank suggests that they want the site to be reliably operable long term. In other words, North Korea isn't treating Yongbyon as just temporary or vulnerable site. They are investing in making more resilient, which means that they expect their nuclear program to be permanent, not bargaining material. So overall, the modernization of the Yongbyon reinforces a trend we've been seeing for several years. North Korea is moving toward a larger, more sophisticated, and more sustainable nuclear force. And that's something the whole region needs to pay attention to.
Right, indeed. And staying with their nuclear weapons ambitions, Shreyas, earlier this month, well before the publication of this particular analysis by 38 North, at a closed-door National Assembly briefing, South Korean intelligence authorities stressed that North Korea could conduct a seventh nuclear test on very short notice. Do remind us about these remarks and their relevance.
So essentially, the South Korea's Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that North Korea is ready at any stage or at least technically ready, to conduct a nuclear test at its main nuclear test site at Punggye-ri, particularly its tunnel number 3, which has been a major facility for it in the past. And this is where North Korea conducted its previous nuclear tests, and certainly in the last few years there has been increasing evidence, first that they were redeveloping it and restoring it after having demolished part of it in an apparent attempt to show the US and South Korea that they were sincere in negotiations, but then they just essentially brought those back. And essentially, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency, North Korea is also beefing up efforts to secure nuclear material, strengthen storage capacity, and manufacturing facilities for nuclear warheads. And I think what the message behind this is, they could do it at any time. They certainly are preparing for it. But at the same time, we need to still bear in mind, this is a message that we have repeatedly heard from lots of agencies in South Korea, the US, elsewhere, since 2022. I think at that point, there were already signs that it was technically ready. And whether or not North Korea conducts a test fundamentally will come down to a lot of different factors. As far as North Korea is concerned, of course, they do not want a repeat of 2006, when their first nuclear test, which resulted in a lower yield. So I'm sure they'll take into account many different factors when deciding when to carry out the test.
Right, and staying with this test, Professor Park, pundits here remain divided over prospects of a seventh nuclear test by North Korea. Some believe that the regime may conduct such a test to secure leverage, if you will, ahead of potential engagement with the international community. Others claim the regime will refrain from another nuclear test given the lack of tangible merit. What are your thoughts, Professor Park?
Well, there are credible arguments on both sides. Let me start with why nuclear test might happen. First, there is a technical argument. Some experts believe that if North Korea wants to further miniaturize, standardize, and mass produce its warheads, an additional nuclear test could be technically useful. Second, there is some political motive. Historically, North Korea has often used major provocation when it wants to shift the political landscape. For example, after launching the Hwasong-15 ICBM on November 2017, Kim Jong-un declared the completion of a nuclear force and then immediately turned to diplomacy with the United States and South Korea. North Korea tends to create its own justification, its own moment before changing gears. And right now, Kim has been leaving the door slightly open for renewed talks with President Trump. So it's entirely possible that North Korea could conduct a nuclear test, claim victory over strategic success, and then pivot to dialogue from a position of perceived strength. Let me explain why a seventh nuclear test might not happen. First, the political cost would be extremely high. Even though Trump has shown willingness to talk with Kim Jong-un, a high-intensity provocation like a nuclear test could make diplomacy much harder. U.S. domestic opinion would turn sharply negative, and Trump could feel pressure to respond strongly. And second, China does not want a large-scale provocation right now. A nuclear test would push South Korea, the United States, Japan even closer together, and it could trigger additional U.S. military deployment in the Pacific, all of which work against China's interest. And third, it could change South Korea's policy. At the moment, Seoul emphasized engagement and cooperation with the North, but a nuclear test would dramatically increase the sense of threat and further damage public opinion toward North Korea. So when you put it all together, a nuclear test could actually make it more difficult for North Korea to achieve what it wants most, being recognized even informally as a de facto nuclear weapon state.
Right, something to think about for sure then. Shreyas, moving forward, North Korea, despite its own nuclear weapons ambitions, it has strongly condemned the nuclear submarine deal between South Korea and the US. What exactly did the regime say, and what are the broader implications of its warning?
So last week, North Korea essentially accused South Korea of seeking a nuclear submarine as part of its own nuclear weaponization efforts, and warned that this will set off a nuclear domino phenomenon across the region and across Asia, essentially saying this is going to lead to much more severe consequences. This is going to spark a nuclear arms race. And at the same time, they also viewed this, they used this message to object to the US and South Korea's use of the phrase denuclearization of North Korea rather than the Korean Peninsula, saying this makes it clear that these countries are essentially denying North Korea's nuclear status while forging ahead with strengthening South Korea's own nuclear ambitions. And a lot of this really feeds into North Korea's narratives over the past few years. One, that it is a nuclear state, and the way the US and South Korea operate is fundamentally a denial of its rights, of its sovereign rights. But at the same time, it has also used US-South Korea cooperation to justify its own nuclear development, which is why it has already been developing its nuclear sub for years now. It has been doing this since long before South Korea, but rather than viewing it as hypocrisy that it is pointing it out, it is essentially using it to justify what has already been the case with North Korea for a while. And once again, they did the same thing on this occasion and said a lot of this comes down to the US attempt to extend its hegemony over Asia and acting through South Korea in that manner. And so, as usual, they turn to their tried and tested formula of saying, we are essentially defending ourselves from an existential threat posed by a nuclear alliance between the US and South Korea. That is why we want to develop our own nukes. That's why we are pursuing our own nukes, which is quite standard for North Korea, just taking any cooperation between the US and South Korea and using that simply to justify its own nuclear development, which has been going on a lot longer.
Right, and with regard to the US, Professor Park, in late October, President Donald Trump prompted quite a bit of international concern by posting online that he had instructed his defense ministry to restart nuclear weapons testing. Should we be worried about a global nuclear arms race, do you think, Professor Park?
Well, that's a very important question, and I would say we should be concerned, but not necessarily panic. President Trump's remarks certainly raised alarms because the United States has not conducted a nuclear test since 1992, and restarting testing would break a very strong international norm. If the United States were to resume testing, it could trigger responses from other nuclear armed states, not only Russia and China, but potentially could like North Korea we just mentioned. But at the same time, we need to recognize the political context. Trump often used very dramatic language online. It does not automatically mean the United States policy will change overnight. Restarting nuclear testing is extremely complicated politically, diplomatically, and even technically. And the United States Congress and scientific community and many allies would strongly oppose it. However, if the comments signals a broader shift toward less restraint among major powers, that's where the danger lies. We are already seeing intensified competition in advanced nuclear technologies, things like the hypersonic delivery system, tactical nuclear weapons, and new type of warheads. So we are not in a full-scale Cold War-style arms race, but we are in the period where the nuclear risks are growing, misunderstandings are more likely, and arms control norms are weakening. So should we worry? Yes, in the sense that this kind of rhetoric erodes global stability and encourages other states to follow suit. But we should also remember that institutional constraints, allied pressure, and international diplomacy still make an actual return to United States nuclear testing a very high bar. In short, the risk is real, but it's not inevitable. And that's why careful diplomacy and stronger communication among major powers are more important now than ever.
Right, and therefore no need to panic then. Meanwhile, back here on the Korean Peninsula, Shreyas, in an interview with the Turkish news outlet, President Lee Jae-myung reaffirmed his commitment to reunification on the Korean Peninsula. And speaking within your capacity as a journalist covering North Korea-related activities, what are your takeaways from the President's latest remarks?
Well, his emphasis was very much on the idea of promoting reconciliation, a peaceful coexistence and reconciliation for now, but at the same time saying that unification remains the ultimate goal. And a lot of this is very much seemingly aimed at assuaging possible North Korean concerns about the idea of unification by absorption, which certainly there are some elements in South Korea where that has been proposed. An option that involves taking over North Korea entirely, which the Kim regime definitely is opposed to. And a lot of this is consistent with Lee Jae-myung's overall inter-Korean policy since he took office, which is promote, in his own words, exchange, normalization, and denuclearization. The last one, perhaps North Korea won't approve of entirely. And at the same time, eventually a move towards a goal of peaceful coexistence without completely doing away with the overall goal of unification as an overall goal in the future. But at the same time, I think we also need to bear in mind there are more other players here. And as far as North Korea is concerned, right now they're not willing to talk to South Korea in general, and they've already walked away from the goal of unification period. At least that's how Kim Jong-un has put it. And so even if Lee Jae-myung makes all the right noises in terms of from Pyongyang's perspective, for now, at least, it does not seem that North Korea is going to be receptive to any of these ideas.
Right then. In the meantime, Professor Park, speaking within your capacity as a renowned scholar with regard to North Korea-related matters, where do you stand with regard to the debate over the merits and setbacks of reunification of the two Koreas?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge both the long-term merit and the very real challenges. On the positive side, the reunification is fundamentally about the ending a decade-long division that has separated families, created enormous security risk, and kept the Korean Peninsula in a constant state of tension. In the long run, a unified Korea could mean greater stability, more economic potentials, and a chance for the Korean people, North and South, to live without the threat of conflict or nuclear weapons. Culturally and historically, we share a common identity, and many Koreans still feel reunification is part of our unfinished national story. But at the same time, we have to be honest about the setbacks. The political, economic, and social gap between the two Koreas has grown dramatically over the past 70 years. We are talking about the completely different political systems, level of development, and worldviews. Even with the best intentions, the process of integrating these two very different societies would be extremely complex and costly. And under the current security environment, with North Korea's nuclear program and its political trajectory, reunification is not something that can happen quickly or easily. So where do I stand? I see reunification as a long-term goal that remains important for the Korean people, but I also believe we need a realistic step-by-step approach. before we talk about the full political unification, we need the stability, dialogue, humanitarian cooperation, and some level of trust building. Without those foundations, and the sudden move toward reunification could create more instability rather than less. In other words, reunification is desirable in principle, but achieving it requires patience, careful planning, and much more favorable security and political environment than we have today.
Right, very important things to think about for sure. All right, Professor Park, on that note, we'll end today's talk. As always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Shreyas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.